And Morgan, what we've seen that's been happening in the Ukraine, it's hard to understand what it is, and it's hard to know how we're supposed to. Of course, we have great sympathy for people who are losing their lives and the turmoil and the sadness that goes along with war, but it's hard to. It's just, you say, what do you do about it? What do we do about it?
Yeah. Well, do we have to do something about every conflict in the world? I mean, are we the world's police force where we feel like we've got to go out and get involved? Because I wonder if they're having a national conversation in other countries like, say, Argentina. Are they saying, what do we do about what's going on in Ukraine? Or do they just say, that's the Ukraine, this is Argentina, we are not going to get involved? Now, so things are different here in the U.S. We tend to say about anything going on anywhere in the world that falls into our national interests, and we somehow need to be involved. And we've adopted this concept that our natural interests includes the well-being of so-called innocent people or people who are in democracies around the world. Now, let's be clear here, though. I do want to be clear about this. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is an illegal invasion. It is an act of war. Russia has committed war against the country of Ukraine. Now, we've talked about on the show, and Russia may certainly feel that it has reasons for doing that. But if you look back to what we did with the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, we did not invade Cuba on the threat that they were going to put the missiles there. We got them to stop. Right, the Russians or the Soviets at that time to stop with putting the missiles there, but we didn't actually go to war over that. Russia, technically that red line was not crossed that Russia created and said, Ukraine can't join NATO and you can't have missiles located in the Ukraine. That red line wasn't crossed, and they decided to invade anyway. So that's an act of war. There are a lot of serious things going on. We've seen a lot more videos. I'll tell you, it does look to me like the Russian army is getting a little bit bogged down. I think they thought they were going to be more successful more quickly. I think they've run into a much stiffer resistance from the Ukrainians than they expected, and the Ukrainians are very well armed because we've been selling and shipping a lot of war material to that country, and they're actually very well armed with sort of these fire and forget missiles, the shoulder-fired missiles, the anti-aircraft missiles that appear to be doing so much destruction to the Russian army, and also the anti-tank missiles, the javelins. And these are all very easy for folks with not a lot of training to operate. They're so heavily run by computers that basically it's a fire and forget situation. You just have to get the tank in the camera, in the view box, essentially, in the aperture for the javelin, fire it, and then the javelin goes way up in the air and comes down on the tank. But anyway, you can, once you push the fire button and it takes off, you can head out of there. You don't need to stick around and keep the target on the tank or anything like that. It sort of takes care of everything. So they've actually been having quite a bit of success. I mean, they're claiming, I think it was just yesterday, they shot down 8 aircraft. That's a lot. I mean, the Russians are losing a lot of aircraft. The Russians claim they've lost about 500, a little more than 500 soldiers. The Ukrainians claim they've killed at least 10,000 Russians. Now, if the number is 10,000, that's a lot of troops that have been killed in the last essentially 10 days, a week to 10 days of this war. So that's a big deal. Some of the reports that I'm getting are that the Ukrainians are mounting a very stiff resistance, and it does kind of seem that the Russians may be bogged down, because I just saw something this morning that popped up, and that is that the Russians are saying that as long as their terms are met, and they've listed out what their terms are, then essentially the fighting can stop immediately. So, and the conditions are basically the same ones that they've always been. Now, they've added a few. That's the interesting thing, is one, they want Ukraine to change its constitution now to actually put neutrality, permanent neutrality, into its constitution. But we know the Russians have always said that their goal was for Ukraine to be neutral and not to have U.S. or NATO missiles located in it. And with those two goals, essentially, then they would not need to invade the Ukraine. I'm not saying that those two goals justify the invasion of Ukraine. I'm just saying that's what the Russians have long said. Now, they have invaded, and now basically that's what they're asking for. That, along with recognition of those two breakaway republics in the eastern part of the Ukraine that are mostly Russian-speaking people anyway. So if they'll recognize those two as independent, if they'll put neutrality into the Constitution itself, and then agree that Ukraine will never join NATO and that they will not allow the location of any U.S. missiles there or NATO missiles there, then things will stop immediately. So it seems to me, based on that, the Russians are looking for a way out of this conflict, that it's not going as well for them. Obviously, they could just have whatever they wanted if Ukraine had surrendered or if they'd already won the war, if they'd conquered Ukraine. Now, this brings into focus something that the U.S. did right off the bat, which I think was very interesting. If you noticed, right off the bat, as soon as the invasion started, the U.S. offered to President Zelensky to get him out of there, to help him flee. If you remember that. And President Zelensky said, no, I'm going to stay. I'm Ukrainian. I'm going to stay, and I'm going to fight. And they apparently have stayed, and they have put up quite the fight. Now, why was it that we were offering right off the bat to decapitate the political leadership of that country by moving him out of the country? Well, I mean, that doesn't seem like that was a very wise maneuver, because that would have resulted in probably Ukraine falling much more quickly. If the political leadership abandons a country, kind of like what we saw in Afghanistan. Remember how we saw the president of Afghanistan packing I don't know how many, $26 million into his little truck or whatever and driving for the border or whatever stunt he pulled? When that happens, then the rest of the country falls very quickly thereafter because the leadership is so important. So, if you go out there and you look at the videos, you can clearly see aircraft are being shot down. You can see videos of attack helicopters. You can see videos of airplanes being shot down by these shoulder-fired missiles. We can see the videos of the tanks being hit. We can see the aftermath of the tanks being hit. There are a lot of Russian soldiers that have been captured that are now being paraded on TV and who are coming out basically against the war on TV. And we see this. This is obviously some propaganda that you always try to affect in war. We always see them trying to affect it when they capture our troops. But they're basically having folks, Russian soldiers, say, hey, we didn't want to be in this war. We didn't know we were coming to Ukraine. We didn't want to go to war. We don't want to kill these people. Russian people at home stand up against this. So I would say, based on all of these data points, that the war is not going particularly well. At the same time, if you're betting on who's going to win the war, I mean, you're certainly going to bet on Russia, right, as it stands right now. They've still got the more powerful, more well-funded military. They're still on the move. They're still shelling the cities. They still seem to be have the advantage, even though I don't think things are going quite as well as they originally expected. And into all of this, you throw a couple of other data points, and that is a broad-scale cry across the American media and think tanks and intelligentsia of this concept that we should put a no-fly zone in place over Ukraine, which would be akin to a declaration of war against Russia. How is a no-fly zone enforced? You shoot down any planes that fly into a no-fly zone. So Russia currently is conducting all kinds of aircraft sorties over the country of Ukraine. If we were to suddenly say nobody can fly over there, we're going to shoot them down, including you Russians. And the Russians, what do you think? They're just going to stop? They're in the middle of a war. They have to support their troops on the ground. I mean, you can't just stop air operations. So ultimately, they would break the no-fly zone. Then we would have to decide, do we shoot them down? If we shoot them down, I mean, are we in World War III? Quite possibly. And nuclear missiles could start flying. And, I mean, we need to be awfully, awfully careful of that kind of a scenario. We do not want to go playing around with getting into a direct war against the country of Russia, which has, I think, the largest stock of nuclear weapons of any country in the entire world. So we're playing with fire to get into the war with them. Unfortunately, we basically ought to just have to kind of step back. I mean, it seems like the Ukrainians are defending themselves. I certainly hope that they're successful. It's very sad for all the people who are fleeing the country, all the innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of a war, just like it is in every war. But then we've got people in our own government, people like Lindsey Graham going on TV and suggesting that somebody in Russia ought to assassinate Vladimir Putin. And he did this on TV. He said, I believe he said that they ought to have somebody like a Colonel Stauffenberg, who, if you remember that movie, the Valkyrie movie, he was the guy in Germany who essentially put together a coup that tried to unseat Hitler. They were ultimately unsuccessful. They came kind of close, but that was Operation Valkyrie. And anyway, so he's suggesting there ought to be somebody in Russia who does that to Vladimir Putin. I think that's a dangerous suggestion. I think it's kind of reckless for a sitting high-level U.S. politician. I mean, we're not talking about a city of Tampa city councilman here. We're talking about a U.S. senator essentially suggesting that a foreign leader ought to be assassinated. You know, we generally haven't done that. We've tried to stay away from the concept, at least openly, of assassinating foreign leaders, although a lot of people would argue that if you look at the actual data, I mean, there has certainly been a campaign of assassination of foreign leaders that even maybe we've engaged in over the decades. But leaving that aside, I mean, we generally, at least on the surface level, say that we don't do that. We're not into assassinating opposing politicians, even in a time of war. So this is a change in tone that I think is really not very well thought out by people like Lindsey Graham. I mean, Lindsey Graham himself is at some degree of risk, being a known politician, and so do you really want to get into the business where we're, if two countries are either at war or at a point of a cold war against each other, that they start just looking at taking out each other's politicians? I'm not sure that's a good result. A couple more interesting things that have happened in the Ukraine, and boy, you've got to say these people are tough. The Ukrainians are really, really tough people, and these people are actually battle-hardened because, remember, they've been in battle with the Russians basically since 2014 over in the eastern part of the country. I mean, that part of the country is just war-torn right now. So they're pretty battle-hardened troops and people, and they're not messing around. I mean, they just had a peace negotiator that they thought was slipping information to the Russians. They sent their special forces out, shot this guy in the head. There's video of this. They sent them out and shot this guy dead. He's their own negotiator. Their own negotiator for their own side was apparently slipping information to the Russians, and so they sent the special forces out to kill their own Ukrainians. The Ukrainians killed their own peace negotiator with their own special forces because their own peace negotiator was apparently slipping something to the Russians, or at least they thought that. So they didn't just remove the guy and replace him. They literally killed him. So these are some tough people. These people are willing to go the distance. So I think Russia's in a lot of trouble in the Ukraine right now. It looks like to me, based on what I've seen over the past week since our last show, it's very interesting. I guess we'll have to see how it all plays out. There is a little bit of concern, though, as to what's coming next, right? And we could talk about this a little bit on the other side of the break, but what exactly is coming next because of what we did to Russia last week, where we essentially declared economic war on Russia, and quite successfully, I might add. I mean, I was stunned at how successful our sanctions and economic warfare were last week against Russia. We'll be right back. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.